Okay, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the rise of industry after the Civil War in the United States. And particularly, we're going to look at the Civil War as the cause for a lot of this industrialization and economic development after the Civil War, and consider the Civil War as a turning point, and not just in a traditional way where the Civil War was a turning point for race relations, as far as the end of slavery and then the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but look about how it acted as a turning point, particularly in the northern states and the Midwestern states. So let's look at signposts for this thing. Was the Civil War a turning point for industrialization? Some people say no. A lot of people think that the development of the American economy started during the age of Jackson in the 1830s and 1840s, and that what we saw in the end of the 1800s was just a continuation of that, where the Civil War was just kind of like a hiccup on that road. But it also brings up some bigger issues because the post-Civil War, you have a different kind of business, particularly what we might call trusts, but what we usually call today things monopolies. And why should we be concerned about monopolies? And this question first comes up in American history in the period between the Civil War and World War I. And finally, we're going to look at different types of monopolies. One is called a vertical integration, where you get monopoly by controlling each stage of the production process, or horizontal immigration, where one controls all the businesses at one point in the production process. So first, let's look at economic development. So before the Civil War, economic development was mostly small-scale family businesses, where it means if you had a factory, it was probably owned by one family, and the capital, the money to run that factory, was raised within one family. It wasn't like modern things where we have stocks and shares and we have directors and things of that sort. After the Civil War, we have what we may call corporations, which means they are separate from their owners, which means legally these corporations are different kinds of entities. They're not the same as the person who started the business, but they have a legal status that makes them independent. And for many Americans, this seemed to challenge ideas about smallness and particularly about small business being the ideal in the American economy. However, there were a lot of other things that were changing in the 19th century. The first one is westward expansion. Before the Civil War, westward expansion was mostly to the Mississippi River and maybe a little bit on the west coast. But we're going to see things in the Civil War is going to change that, particularly the land grant acts that allow people to homestead in the west. And also, for example, the Morrill Act that allowed for land grant colleges. We're going to see changes in transportation, meaning the rise of the railroad and the steamship, and also changes in communication, particularly the telegraph. We might see changes in the reform movement. Before the Civil War, they're mostly focused, the reform urge is mostly dealing with trying to eliminate or to reform slavery. After the Civil War, we see reform movements that are mostly going to deal with the problems of industrialization and also, let's say, immigration, which is related to that. And finally, we're going to see changes in immigration. Before the Civil War, what you're going to see mostly is immigration from the north and west of Europe, meaning Irish and German immigration, as well as the forced migration of African slaves to the United States. After this, immigration is going to change, and it's going to be mostly from the south and eastern parts of Europe, meaning countries like Italy, Poland, Russia, and Greece, which is fundamentally different. They're going to be different because they're going to be from different religions, Catholic versus Protestant, and also very often languages other than English. So in here, we have a question of whether the Civil War is a turning point. Does the Civil War actually change the before and after story when we talk about economic development, or is the Civil War just a random event that just happens to happen on this trajectory of change? So that's kind of a question that we're going to consider as we talk about this. Let's turn to the whole big picture, and this might say is how all the different pieces go together. And if this looks a little bit like a Rube Goldberg invention, you're probably right. We're going to take it piece by piece. So let's take a look at the first piece. The impact of war mobilization. So the main thing that happens during the war, and particularly the Civil War, is that it was not, say, a small affair, and it was not a local affair. It was a long war which required the national government to mobilize resources, which means they couldn't just call out Minutemen or the militia, but they had to basically draft people into the army, get logistics, move things, transport them from one place to another, and in many ways that created a different scale than had previously existed. So the first thing was the veterans networks. And the important thing about the Civil War is that men from mostly different parts of the country, from the Midwest, the East, the Northeast, and they fought alongside each other. And so really for the first time, you're seeing people from Indiana interacting with people from Massachusetts, and not simply because they were relatives and people had migrated from the East Coast west, but that they actually had separate, let's say, local economies that were going to interact with each other. Previous to this, most people lived local societies. They lived within 5 to 10 miles from where they were born, mostly working on the farm. And so you have a shift from local economy to a national economy. And because veteran networks often created the basis for business networks, whether it's mutual aid societies or fraternal organizations, you started to see networks crisscross the entire North. And a lot of these were based upon the networks that were built during the Civil War among soldiers. The second thing was the development of an officer corps. And you could have seen this as the genesis of corporate middle managers. Those bureaucrats, maybe people who are not at the top of the organization, but the people in the middle. And how you work in a large bureaucracy or a hierarchy is something very different. Before the Civil War, most people were farmers. They were self-employed. No one told them what to do. They decided when to plant, they decided when to harvest, they decided what crops to grow, and they more or less controlled how much work was being done. Now you work in a large organization, and you have to be able to take orders, and you have to be able to supervise people who you might not be able to directly observe. And service in the Army really was kind of a training in working in an organization of this sort because of the scale of the organization. And lastly, a lot of things about logistics. The quartermaster, one reason why the Union was successful during the Civil War was not so much its ability to fight, but its ability to move resources from one place to another, usually via the railroad. And so, once again, this created training for moving things like in a business, moving materials from its origins where the raw materials were coming from to the place of production and finally to the places where they're going to be sold. And all this came out of that. Now, another part to this was the increase of corporate charters, which meant that the 14th Amendment, which was created for equal protection of laws, mostly for former slaves, also became, let's say, part of it is that the equal treatment of individuals and corporations being treated as individuals and their ability to form these legal individuals that were corporate forms allowed, for example, the development of these large organizations, economic organizations that we're going to see rise after the Civil War. So another example of this is just the scale, and I keep going back to that before the Civil War, the scale was much smaller. So here on the right, the lower right, we see the Peekskill Iron Works. And you can see this was a major ironworks in the East Coast along the Hudson River. It's not that large. This is mostly just a roof over what we might think of as a traditional blacksmith shop. And yes, there is a railroad there to take the ore out, but it's not very large. And on the left, we see the Lackawanna Iron Works in Scranton, the origins of the Lackawanna, which later would become, I believe, Bethlehem Steel, and then become the large part of the U.S. Steel. They're a large foundry in Scranton. Once again, quite larger, and this is one of the more important, let's say, ironworks, but compare that to what was built in the 1890s, the Bethlehem Steel Lackawanna plant south of Buffalo, New York. And you can see just by looking at it the difference in scale. These are much larger productions as far as, let's say, what is under the roof. You can see, for example, in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the management, which means this is not simply like a single person, but you have a whole office running these large corporations. And this could be just an example of what's happening, this huge increase in scale in all businesses. Here shows you what happened to the production of steel. As you can see, shortly after the Civil War, it's quite low. But by the years leading into World War I, you're going to see a huge increase in steel production in the United States. And you might think of this as just a way of tracking the increase in the American economy from a relatively small production economy that is mostly agricultural to an economy that is highly developed in an industrial sense and producing without peer in the entire world. So the second thing that the Civil War did is that it had a political effect, and that was the defeat of the South. Prior to the Civil War, the South dominated national politics. And if we go to just the bottom of this slide, I think the easiest way to think about this was who was winning presidential elections. So from George Washington to Andrew Johnson, the South wins 14 of the 20 presidential elections. And you might think it's actually even larger because many of the Northerners who were elected were often elected with Southern votes or as allies of Southern interests. So basically the South had a stranglehold, partly because of the Three-Fifths Clause. They were getting extra representation and extra electoral votes because of slavery, but also the population was mostly concentrated in the South. And over time, you're going to see the North become larger and larger, and particularly the Northeast, meaning New England and Mid-Atlantic states, kind of coming into a close alliance with the Midwestern states. So between Andrew Johnson and Woodrow Wilson, who was originally from Virginia in World War I, you see the South wins 0 presidential elections, which means the center of gravity for the national politics is moved from the South into the North. Now, if you wanted to extend this even further and go from 1868 to 1968 and count Woodrow Wilson really as a Northerner, someone who was governor of New Jersey, the South doesn't win an election, a Southerner doesn't win the presidency until 1964, when Lyndon Baines Johnson from Texas would win the presidency. So that would basically, if you think that it's 100 years, the South basically controls national politics, but then for the next 100 years, the focus and the power in national politics is clearly in the North, in the Northeast. So what was Southern politics? Well, mostly Southern politics had several policies. It was pro-agriculture, which means they were anti-manufacturing. What this meant is that they did things that promoted, let's say, growing of crops on plantations, usually a policy of free trade, and they opposed, let's say, tariffs that helped the development of industry in the North and the West. Southern politics was very pro-states' rights, which means they emphasized the control of power by state governments and fought power being concentrated in the national government. Another one, and kind of before, they were anti-tariff, which goes in for the same thing that they were pro-agriculture. Because the United States was exporting agricultural products like cotton and later wheat and other types of products like that, they are pro-free trade because it allowed them to trade things easily and also then to import things cheaply from foreign countries. And they weren't as interested in, let's say, protecting the United States against foreign manufactured products, mainly from England, that would have helped the industrial development in the North. And finally, and mostly in the person of Andrew Jackson, Southern politics was anti-bank. The Jackson Democrats and generally who had focused in the South had opposed the Bank of the United States, one that would, let's say, restrict credit or make it hard to get loans. They were anti-bank, which means they allowed lots of small little banks and also controlled the banks by the states. Now, what this did is because who was getting loans from these banks were mostly farmers. They wanted easy credit because farmers need to borrow money to plant their crop, and they don't make their money until they have their harvest. And the best way to promote that would be easy credit. If you want to have, let's say, more industrial development and stronger financial sector like banks and Wall Street, etc., you want to have banks that are relatively strong and relatively, let's say, restrictive in what kind of loans they give. These were all part of the Southern domination of national politics. Now, what happened is the South got defeated, which means the North started to pass policy that favored their region of the country. And the best way to think of this period after the Civil War, often called the Gilded Age, is that the United States was a developing country, and it's very similar to what we might think of Mexico or China today as far as their policies. So how do the Republicans follow pro-industry policies after the Civil War? Well, as opposed to the anti-bank policies of the South, they favored the gold standard, which means what we might call tight money, which means they tied the value of the American currency to gold, which meant there wasn't as much currency, there wasn't as much money. It basically meant there wasn't as much credit in the system. While the South, both prior and after the Civil War, supported free trade, the policy of the United States really from the Civil War until World War II was protectionist, which means they created tariff barriers, and many economic battles in the late 1800s were over the tariff. Basically, the Republican Party was committed to high tariffs that protected American products from foreign competition. And finally, while the South favored state rights, which also meant state control of the economy, The Republicans favored a national market, which means they favored policies that allow people to ship products across state lines. So how did this actually help the American economy? Well, first of all, the gold standard helped them attract international investment, particularly from English banks, while protectionism kept out these foreign products. Now, this was good for the owners of industry in the Northeast and the Midwest, but what it really hurt was farmers who were mostly exporting the products, whether it was wheat on the Great Plains or cotton in the South. And so you see the North basically passing policies that help their region but are not so good for other regions of the country. And you'll be able to see this when you see the discontent in the South and the Midwest in populism, kind of, let's say, attacking the concentrated power of money in the Midwest and the Northeast. So the final thing is the state power, meaning states like New York, Alabama, South Carolina. They lost their ability to regulate business, and partly was because states controlled charters or corporate law prior to the Civil War. But with the passage of the 14th Amendment, many of these things came under federal purview. So just as an example of the difference between the North and South as political regions, you can kind of see this on this map with votes in 1875 and 1883. And the reason why they're different is that we have a census in 1880, and therefore these congressional districts look a little bit different. The yellow is the people who voted against these laws. Resumption of specie payments is a way of saying return to the gold standard. And the General Tariff Act basically means people who supported the tariff. The green areas are the people who voted for these things, and the yellow are the people who voted against it. As you can see, most of the votes against are concentrated in the South, and most of the votes for in the Northeast and the Midwest. And so on the gold standard and voting for a high tariff, you can see the support is mostly coming from the northern regions of the country. So related to this was war finance, which meant to fight this war, they had to raise money to fight the Civil War. And how did they do that? Actually led to a lot of things that helped the formation of businesses in the immediate period after the Civil War. So the Civil War cost a lot of money. And it's not money that the United States government had, but it's often the times that happens in war. They basically issued bonds, and they issued what were called greenbacks, which were paper currency, i.e. green in color, hence greenbacks, that were not backed by gold. And essentially what this created was a lot of easy credit for startup businesses, because a lot of money was infused into the system. Because since the government just put more money to finance their war, that money was also available in the banks and then became finance for all the business in the war, well above just the revenues they got from selling things to the government. And on these graphs here on the right, you can see the increase in debt in per capita terms. As you can see, national debt was pretty low, and then you can see in 1860, the first year of the Civil War, it goes from about below $10 per capita to something around $80 per capita, so an increase of 8 times. Now, it declines after the Civil War, but there was a lot of debt. And so the point is you had an expansion of credit to fight the Civil War, leading to startups, but then a retraction of credit, which then gave power to the initial group of firms. The graph on the bottom just shows you the debt to GDP ratio, the debt to GDP ratio over different periods of time. As you can see, the Civil War kind of stands out as a peak of debt in the 1860s. However, it was kind of repeated for our other great conflicts, World War I, World War II, and then later you can see the expansion of credit at the very end, which was to combat the Great Recession that occurred in 2008. So from 1860 to 1880, you had a lot of new small businesses, and the market was very competitive. Because there's all this money out there, and this money is not backed with gold, there's basically an increase in the money supply, an increase in credit in the system. And then in 1875, and then again in 1879, you have what is called the Specie Resumption Act, which meant that the government was going to tie the issuance of currency back to gold. Essentially, it was going to go back on the gold standard. And this is going to lead to a contraction, a reduction in the money supply. When credit contracts, this led to bankruptcies, consolidation, and also monopolization. What happened essentially is that the reason why you started to see large companies and monopolies is because only they had enough money, enough credit to then finance their operations. If you were a small business and you couldn't get credit and you couldn't get a loan from the bank, you couldn't compete. And when you couldn't compete, you form monopolies, which allow you to, let's say, when you have a monopoly, you can charge higher prices, which means you have higher profit margins. It makes it easier to compete. So the issuance of greenbacks, it basically democratized Wall Street because it allowed for small people to have kind of some say. And you started to see people like Jay Cooke, one of the first robber barons, sell greenback war bonds to ordinary Americans, which means instead of just selling stocks to rich people or the very wealthy, you saw people being able to buy small shares, whether by buying war bonds or by investing in stock in some of these things, because there's a lot of money sloshing around the system. So this led to a lot of robber barons, and many of these got started as war profiteers. And many of these have connections to the local area in the Hudson Valley, and I just indicate where some of these towns that they're located with. So some of these robber barons, the first three, Leland Stanford, who helped build the railroads to the Pacific. He's also the one that Stanford University is named after because he gave the money to start it. Henry Villard, who's buried in Sleepy Hollow, New York, helped build the Northern Pacific. Chauncey Depew, from Peekskill, New York originally, was a vice president or president, started off as a lawyer for the New York Central Railroad and later, I think, became the CEO or the president of the New York Central Railroad. And he was from Peekskill. He also later became a senator for New York State. And then E.H. Harriman, connected to the Pennsylvania Railroad, from Rockland County, New York, and also Harriman State Park and Bear Mountain State Park were used to be his own private lands where he lived way back when. Another set of oil barons came around oil and chemicals. The most famous was John D. Rockefeller, even though he originally was from Ohio and Cleveland area, born in a state in central Westchester, basically Botanical Hills, Cookut. And then also Leo Baekeland, the founder, you could say the first one about plastics, who came from Yonkers. You also had iron and steel magnates, and here you have Andrew Carnegie, who originally associated with Pennsylvania and Carnegie Steel in Pittsburgh, but later moved once again to the Westchester area and is buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. And Henry Frick, the Frick Gallery, a robber baron, but then later known as an art collector, and there's several different art galleries around the country named after him. And lastly, you had a bunch of robber barons in finance. The most famous is J.P. Morgan, J.P. Morgan Chase, the founding of that bank. Very important, we'll get more into him in detail. Jay Cooke, Jay Gould, people that were involved in Wall Street speculation and selling of bonds. James Fisk, and also Daniel Drew. And all these were people in the early, you could say, finance, stock markets, some of them perhaps more respectable than others, but all people who were major players buying and selling stock, mostly in railroads at this time in the post-Civil War era. So another part of this is the rise of Wall Street. And the issuance of greenbacks are basically debt securities, which means they're bonds. The government says, I'm going to give you this green piece of paper. There's nothing behind it except my promise to pay you back the value of this bond at some later date. So these robber baron corporations, these corporations that were run by these robber barons that basically operated by creating monopolies, they issued equity securities, which means you could own a share of a railroad. And this is more about stocks, meaning you could have a share of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central Railroad. They went public. And what this shows you is the performance of stocks versus bonds. And really from the time of Jefferson, 1803, to about the end of Reconstruction in 1871, bonds are a better investment than stocks. Now, a lot of that is the quality of corporations that you could buy stock in. But you can see from 1871 right up to the Great Depression in 1929, you're going to see stocks be a much better gamble. Part of this is because stocks are ownership in companies that have monopolies over their production, which means they're going to have higher revenues, which means their value of the stock in that company is going to be worth a lot more. And so you could say this is kind of, you see the growth of the stock market, even though it doesn't happen immediately, but essentially between the period of the Civil War and World War I, World War II, the stock market has become much more important. Now, it's easier to raise money by issuing stocks because you don't have to go through a bank and you don't have to get some of the restrictions, and this is where the robber barons come in. Stocks are prone to manipulation. And you saw many, in a sense, buying and selling of railroad stocks being manipulated during this period as a way of enriching the stock jobbers or the robber barons at the expense of the public. So another part to this is you might call the industrial ideology. Why did people accept this kind of rough competition, this winner take all kind of society? Because this wasn't really what the economy was before the Civil War, where people lived in local economies, farming communities, and villages. They would have seen these large corporations as being un-American, you know, too big. If you think of Thomas Jefferson, who talks about the yeoman farmer, the small farmer being the core of the American system, and his war against Alexander Hamilton, someone who had an idea of larger corporations and a much more powerful government, but also a lot more powerful economic interests. Why was this country that had basically adopted Jefferson's point of view suddenly swing to the Hamilton point of view and encourage the growth of these large business? I think you can say there were two ideas, and they kind of came in, they joined up around the time of the Civil War. The first one is this idea of social Darwinism. And we have to remember that Darwin put out his theory of evolution just as the Civil War was beginning in 1859. So this idea of Darwinism, that competition is a good thing, and the winners, and certainly the way that Americans saw the Civil War was that the more fit North beat the less fit South, and that was a form of social evolution. Because basically the North was more modern and more dynamic, the South was more traditional and more backward-looking, was a reason for why the North beat the South in the Civil War, and this seemed to fit in these ideas of Darwinism. The second one is you had, some idea coming out of Adam Smith, but maybe lately coming into the United States, was the wealth of nations, which basically sang the praises to competition. But they're a little bit different. So the idea of laissez-faire is basically about equilibrium. Let things be, let them be alone. And the idea of social Darwinism is this idea that societies are developing all the time. So while laissez-faire basically is the equilibrium, evolution is talking about change, that the system is always changing. So let me explain more about laissez-faire is about equilibrium, because basically what should happen if everyone competes, the best will survive and they'll dominate it, and there's no more competition. And that competition should lead to balance, meaning the supply equals demand. The price should be set at an equilibrium price. If it's too high, basically it should stay in one place rather than going up and down. Darwinism is more that there's competition and there's winners and losers. What they have is they share this idea of competition being good, but competition is good for social Darwinists because it leads to evolution. It leads to a selection of, let's say, the better parts of the species or the better organizations that are more able to survive. Competition is good in laissez-faire because it leads to kind of a more balanced system. And these ideas come in and they give rise to not just the pro-monopoly point of view, but also the anti-monopoly point of view. Because a monopoly might seem as those who survive. So if I'm a robber baron, I see monopoly as a good thing. The reason why I have a monopoly is because I was better or more fit than my competitors, and therefore I control an industry. So someone like J.P. Morgan or Rockefeller or Carnegie would say, the reason why we have these large corporations is not because we're taking advantage of the system, but in fact we have proven we are the best in the field, and you could say the economic process has selected us to run these large corporations because we're better at it. At the same time, it led to less competition, and so the emphasis on social Darwinism and laissez-faire led to an anti-monopoly because monopolies are seen as being anti-competitive. And the way to solve the problem of monopoly was to create a more competitive environment, either by breaking them up or promoting competition. So what is monopoly? So let's think of this and what happened with monopoly, and particularly with the example of railroads. Why were people so, in a sense, interested or, let's say, wary of these things called monopolies? Well, imagine, for example, you're a farmer and you can produce a bushel of grain for $10. And let's also suppose that he could sell this bushel of grain for $100 if he can get it to the city. Now, remember, you're farming out on the Great Plains. The cities are mostly in the Northeast and the Midwest. how do you get this $10 bushel of grain to the city and get your $90 profit? Well, you have to use a railroad. So you're going to take that bushel of grain, put it on the train, and ship it, of course, to the city, and then be able to sell it at $100. The problem is that there's only maybe one railroad if one or two or three companies control the railroads. So how much should the railroad company charge the farmer to ship to the city? Remember, if he doesn't sell the grain, it's not like he makes $10. It means that he might lose the $10 because he's already paid for the cost of raising the grain. And therefore, if he doesn't sell it, the grain rots, it goes bad, he's out $10. And so he needs to be able to sell this grain. Well, you might think that the railroad could basically charge up to $90 and still get the farmer to take that. So you might think, like, for example, who's making money on this? It's not the farmer, because the farmer is just basically covering his cost. It's not the people getting the grain in the city, because they're paying a very high price for it. Because the railroad has a monopoly over the transportation, it can charge $90 of the $100 value of the bushel, and therefore makes most of the profits. Now, this probably doesn't strike anyone as fair, whether you're a consumer in the city or whether you're a farmer in the countryside. So the railroad probably could charge, you might say 40, okay. I could also say 50, and the farmer's still going to take it. So this is sort of what a monopoly works, is that you have this monopoly and you have the consumer surplus, which is the value to the consumer above the cost of the item, and the producer surplus, which is basically the amount of profit. So monopoly basically restricts competition or restricts production as a way of increasing its profits. Because they could say, rather than selling all the quantity they have, they can just sell one segment at a time. So for example, I might withdraw, like, if I control all the iron or all the steel or all the coal or all the oil or all the railroad routes, if I just sell the first one to the person who wants to use it the most, I can get a very high value for that. And you can see it by the bar touching the demand line. And then I hold back and I sell another unit, 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 until basically I go to where supply leads to marginal revenue, not the demand curve. And therefore I stop production. And what it creates is this social loss, because it means that I'm going to sell less than what people want, because the last group of people probably will not be able to pay the price that I want to demand that maximizes my profits. And as a result, this kind of is bad for society, because it's not simply just moving money from the buyer to the monopoly. It's actually leading to a total loss for society in terms of transactions not completed. Now, you don't need to know this, but this is, if you take economics, this is basically the charts and graphs way of showing why a monopoly is bad for society above and beyond what it produces. So, in a competitive market, value equals cost equals price, which basically means supply equals demand. The cost it makes me produce intersects with the value it is to the consumer, and that's where the price is set. And that means there shouldn't be any profits and there shouldn't be any bargains. Everyone's paying the value that it is to them, and also there's no profits because someone else could come in and basically charge less, and then my profits would disappear. Monopoly means you have an uncompetitive market, which means someone's making a lot of profits because people can't challenge the profits and give the consumers another choice or another alternative to buy the things at in a more competitive price. So there's two ways to do this, to control monopoly. There's horizontal integration and there's vertical integration. So if you think of, let's say, the production process, for example, in this case, oil. Step one would be the oil, taking the oil out of the ground. Then you have to transport the oil to the refineries. The third step would be the processing of the oil to maybe other products such as gasoline or kerosene or some other thing that can be used. Then you have to transport that product to the consumer, and then of course the consumer has to buy it. So there's five, you could say, it's more complicated than this, but you can say there's 5 stages. Now one way I can do is control every step in the process. I can control the oil wells and the pipelines and the refineries and the transportation, and then finally the sale. And this is probably mostly um, something that Carnegie engaged in. He owned the mines, he owned uh, the foundries, he owned the transportation and the railroads, and finally he was also the end seller to the consumer of steel. Rockefeller was more about horizontal integration, which means he controlled one step of the stage and controlled all the things that the stage. So, and for him, it was mostly the refineries. For the most part, Rockefeller did not control the actual oil itself. He was not in the production of oil. But what he was doing was mostly in the processing of the oil into useful products, and then and also the packaging of it, and then using that as a way of getting rebates on the transportation to the final consumer. So Carnegie created U.S. Steel basically on a vertical integration model, and Rockefeller created Standard Oil, which is now Chevron, Exxon, and Mobil today, through horizontal integration. Now, we see this today in terms of media companies. So, for example, Comcast. Comcast is a cable company. It is also tied to NBC, but it doesn't just deliver, let's say, different shows to the consumer through your cable box and selling, let's say, a cable contract to you. It also owns a lot of the production, meaning a lot of the companies that you see on cable. For example, Comcast owns NBC, which means MSNBC, which is a political news channel, CNBC, which is a business channel. It owns companies like Telemundo for Spanish-speaking things. It owns the E Entertainment System. It owns Universal Pictures. It owns the Weather Channel, Bravo, Sci-Fi, USA, Oxygen, the Golf Channel, and also Focus Features, which is another movie company, which means it more or less basically is able to create the product that it's actually going to transfer to the end consumer. And the same thing for Time Warner Cable, which owns things like HBO, CNN, the NBA channel, True TV, Cartoon Network, Adult Swim, and also websites like The Smoking Gun, Bleacher Report, DC Comics, Warner Brothers, which comes with a lot of different types of comic properties and movies, New Line Cinema, and Court TV. So you see this where they're vertically integrated, meaning that they control each step in the process, from the making of the content to the delivery of the content to the actually delivering it to your home or through your cable box, or in some cases through your internet connection. So recently, Time Warner and Comcast proposed a merger. So pre-Comcast Time Warner merger, you can see where, let's say, they have dominance, and you can see where Time Warner and Comcast control the different companies. So if you see it's changing, Time Warner would be the red areas for cable, and then blue would be Comcast. And you can see after the merger, you're going to see all those red areas turn to blue, which means this is more about horizontal integration because they're going to control the delivery of cable to the consumer. And they would be an incredibly large, it would take the second and third largest cable companies and merge them into one company, which theoretically should lead to not just efficiencies, but basically less competition, and therefore they're able to raise prices for consumers. So you see the final product here in the lower right, where most of the Midwest, Ohio, upstate New York, a good part of the East Coast, Florida, Texas, California, would all be controlled by one of those two companies in the new Comcast. Now, as I said, this isn't about controlling content, it's mostly about controlling distribution. So what happens? The number of corporations that control a majority of the U.S. media. So back in 1983, where this chart begins on the left, you can see there are basically 50 corporations control 50% of American media. And you can see over time that's decreased from 50 to 29 by the end of the 1980s, and really it's down to about 5 as we get into the 2000s. Now we can look at what's happened to cable prices. On the graph on the right, you can see inflation, CPI, which is the rise in prices of all items, and that's going up. And that means we should expect prices to go up for all products, regardless of what they are. But your red line shows you the increase in the value of cable. And it's gone from $22.35 to $58.80 over, roughly a 13-year span. And that means the price of cable is increasing much faster than inflation. indicating that probably there's a monopoly dynamic going on because they're able to charge, let's say, more money than just an increase in price. And you might say, well, why are we paying more for cable? Well, you might say, well, there's more cable stations, therefore there's more content, hence the increase in price. But a more likely thing is there's less competition, which means you have less alternatives and you end up paying kind of a higher price for that. And I think that's probably the more common